Wonderful. Well, we'll go ahead and get started then. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Natural Areas Association, and I'd like to welcome you to our first 2021 Pennsylvania Botany webinar. I'm delighted that you are joining us today for Implications of Climate Change for Invasive Species. It's going to be an excellent webinar, and it is the first in a series of 3 webinars being hosted by the Pennsylvania Botany Committee in partnership with the Natural Areas Association. So just a couple of quick intro slides here before we launch into the webinar. Who is PA Botany? We're a group of botanists and plant enthusiasts from Pennsylvania and the surrounding region that have come together to inform and expand the knowledge of Pennsylvania native plants. And we're committed to the protection of the region's native flora. Established in 2012, PA Botany has held a convening of both amateur and professional botanists biennially in the form of the Pennsylvania Botany Symposium and annually in the form of our field workshops, which some of you may know about and have participated in, hopefully. This has all been done in order to advance the knowledge, appreciation, and conservation of our region's native plant heritage. It's also been a way to keep the study of botany alive and well in our region. The planning committee consists of a group of passionate and dedicated volunteers, some of whom have worked together to better understand and conserve Pennsylvania's flora for decades. Without their commitment to this initiative, this programming would not be possible. On behalf of everyone who has enjoyed our past symposia and workshop series, and those of you who are new to the organization, I want to thank the planning committee, the Pennsylvania Botany Planning Committee, for continuing to bring quality educational opportunities to our state. Like many events, the 2020 PA Botany Symposium and the field workshop series was canceled due to the COVID pandemic. And while we're all much more optimistic in 2021 that life might soon get back to normal, there is still much uncertainty related to the balance of this year and a return to in-person events. So not wanting to delay for another year, the PA Botany Committee decided to offer some virtual programming during 2021. Our 2021 webinar series beginning today also includes 2 upcoming webinars: Design and Establishment of Seed Mixes for Prairie Restoration, presented by Dr. Rebecca Barrick, and that will be in June 17th. And then a third webinar, Small and Surrounded, How Population Size and Land Use Can Influence Patterns of Reproduction in a Native Plant Across Remnant Serpentine Barren Grasslands of Southeastern PA, presented by Dr. Rachel Spigler. And that will take place on October 7th. So you will continue to hear from us, from the PA Botany Committee, on information, but these webinars are now all open for registration, so join us if you can. In addition to the webinar series, the Planning Committee is also working to develop some virtual programming for one of the original dates identified for the 2021 PA Botany Symposium, either November 5th or 6th. We're still trying to work that out, but we did decide to offer something to keep us together, keep us convened, keep us talking with one another and learning. The event will be a student-focused event, and it will include hopefully some additional programming that you've come to love from this event. We also hope that you'll mark your calendars for what we hope, and our fingers are crossed, will be an in-person symposium again in 2022. The tentative dates for that will be November 4th and 5th of 2022 at the Penn Stater in State College. First weekend of November, that's our weekend. Okay, so PA Botany is produced in partnership with the Natural Areas Association, and just wanted to say a few things about NAA to familiarize you. We are a national nonprofit membership organization that's dedicated to the support and advancement of natural areas professionals, those who protect biodiversity through science-based conservation, stewardship, and advocacy. We're a community that identifies challenges, develops solutions, shares critical findings, and advances practices in conservation, preservation, and restoration of nature through networking and collaboration. For almost 50 years, NAA has supported natural areas management by bringing the latest science to natural areas professionals. We also host a webinar series, a monthly webinar series. And so if you enjoy learning more about botany and related conservation science, we would like to just invite you to check out a couple of our webinars that are botany related. Two that are up and coming. One is the USDA plants database. This is the new and improved database. For those of you who do use this as a resource tool, I think we're in version 3 of that database now, and that's going to be presented on May 18th by our partners at USDA. And then protecting rare and at-risk species, tools to collect meaningful data with limited resources. That's a July webinar. So check out our website and learn a little bit more about us. And now let's turn to today's presentation. Our presentation today is brought to you by Dr. Bradley. She is a professor of biogeography and invasion ecology in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's interested in how the geographical locations of species across landscapes and regions can inform ecological understanding of species distributions, invasion risk assessments, and conservation planning. Her research has a strong focus on terrestrial plant invasions with a goal of understanding how invasive plant distributions, abundance, and impact vary spatially. Dr. Bradley also leads the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, which addresses the question of how we can better manage for upcoming biological invasions in light of climate change. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bradley, and I'd also like to encourage each of you to post your questions in chat. You're getting used to this, you know how this goes. We'll hold questions till the end. I will monitor for Dr. Bradley, and we will have plenty of time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So with that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lisa, for that introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. If you're anything like me, you've probably spent some recent weekends outside dealing with invasive species. I've spent some quality weekend hours cutting bittersweet out of some trees. I feel like that's not a winning battle, but at least we're trying to save some trees. What I want to talk about today is hopefully a little bit, there's a big challenge associated with climate change and invasive species. But I want to leave you with a point that there is some optimism, that there are some opportunities ahead in terms of things that we can do proactively, because we do have a sense of what's coming up next. So if you're interested in a synthesis of what I'm going to talk about today, I would invite you to check out the Risk Network website, so risknetwork.org, and Lisa later on will post a link to where all of these management challenges reside on that website. But one of our documents is called Double Trouble, and that is a synthesis of how invasive species and climate change are likely to interact. So we all know that invasive plants give us plenty of challenges and plenty of things to think about and work on, maybe for many entire careers. And that's plenty of things, plenty to think about. And so I'm here to tell you now we need to add climate change in the multiple climatic events that are likely to occur associated with climate change. So we're trying to put both of these two things together. And the reason that we do need to put both of those two things together is because for a lot of places in the world, and so Pennsylvania included, there's going to be a big shift. There already is sort of the start of a big shift in the suite of species that we need to be worried about. We have new species arriving all the time. Some of these species, though, are ones that we know about, that we can look to our neighbors to the south and kind of scope out, okay, well, they're dealing with a whole bunch of this particular plant, in a couple of states to the south in Virginia or something like that. Those are the ones that are likely to arrive in Pennsylvania and then eventually make it up to me in Massachusetts. And so that means that on the invasion curve, we're very used to being I think way over here on the invasion curve, right? Where we're dealing with invasive species like like bittersweet, that are already all across the landscape, and there's really not a whole lot you can do in terms of a win against those species. But when we think about climate change, for many, many species, we're actually on the prevention side of things. And that means that we have this rare kind of silver lining opportunity to be proactive and to actually have some wins to keep out some of those species that have the potential to do the most harm in the future. So what I want to talk about today are four main themes. So the first is how rising temperature favors invasive species. The second is thinking about those range shifts and what we know about those. I'm going to talk about climate variability and how that leads to disturbance, which facilitates invasives, and then plants specifically responding favorably to rising CO2. So let's start with that first one, rising temperatures favoring invasive species. So from almost 10 years ago now, the 2013 IPCC report, warming temperatures and longer growing seasons are virtually certain. The more recent IPCC report, if we can be even more certain than virtually certain, we're definitely there. So temperatures are warmer. And what does that mean in terms of invasive plants? So this graph is from what's called a meta-analysis. And in ecology, meta-analyses have become more and more common because we know that any single study could be influenced by lots of different things going on in an ecosystem. But if we can put all of the studies that have looked at a certain phenomenon together and reanalyze those data, then we can have a lot more confidence that this is a general trend, this is a general pattern, and it can't be explained away by a uniqueness of a given ecosystem. So that's essentially what a meta-analysis does. And in this paper from a few years ago, what they did was they looked at all of the experimental studies that they could find that compared the physiological responses of native non-invasive plants grown in pairs with invasive plants under elevated temperature, increased precipitation, and decreased precipitation. And the ones to keep an eye out for are these ones with the little star, which means that invasive plants on the whole are performing significantly better with warmer temperatures, whereas native plants are performing essentially the same, so still crossing this kind of dashed line. And so the question is, okay, well, what could be some mechanisms behind why, on the whole, invasive plants are favored by warmer temperatures where native plants are not? So one reason that might explain that is that this idea of a priority effect in invasion ecology, this is true in ecology generally, that if you are the first out of the gate in the growing season, that you have an advantage over the species that take a little bit longer to green up and start growing. And it turns out that, and this is not this is not a fluke, that many of our invasive plants that we see in the Northeast, so garlic mustard, honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, glossy buckthorn, common buckthorn, those tend to be species that green up very early in the season, and so they have an advantage of this priority effect. So as you have warmer temperatures and you essentially have more and more resources earlier in the growing season for these invasive species that are already raring to go, that gives them an extra advantage in terms of taking advantage of those resources that are newly available early. Another reason that rising temperature could create an advantage for invasive plants is the idea of phenological plasticity, which is essentially the ability of a plant to green up and grow as soon as in this case, temperature conditions are suitable for it. So we know that there are lots of species that respond to day length cues, and then that there are lots of species that respond not so much to daylight cues, but more to temperature cues. So if you happen to be a species that responds more to temperature cues and less to daylight cues, that's an advantage under climate change because temperature is causing spring to come earlier and earlier. And so how do we know that invasive plants might be more likely to be responding to these temperature cues as opposed to day length? Well, there was this really cool study that was done a few years back where some scientists at Boston University recreated a floristic survey that was done in the late 1800s by a botanist from Concord, Massachusetts. So the scientists in more than 100 years later went out and resurveyed for the abundance, both presence and abundance, of all of the different flowering plants that they could find in Concord. And what they found was that the species that were not responding to temperature, so this phylogeny, this is a phylogeny, and all the red are the ones that have declined in abundance or had major declines, and the white ones are ones that didn't change too much. And you can see that there's some strong phylogenetic kind of clumping of areas, types of clades that were responding really poorly or had large losses in abundance over time. And so it turned out that the main reason for those losses, the best predictor of those losses, was a cue in response to day length as opposed to cues in response to temperature. And they followed on with that study and they looked specifically at the native species versus the invasive species and found that the native species on average had really not shifted much at all in their flowering time over that 100-year period. But the invasive species, so that's in the second bar, had actually advanced their growing time by more than 10 days over that 100-year time period. And so that temperature responsiveness is a strong predictor of that increase in species abundance over that time period. And so take home point here is that our invasive species are taking advantage. So we know that invasive species on the whole are responding positively to rising temperature. And that's probably because they're able to take advantage of these lower growing seasons by either already emerging early and taking advantage of extra resources, or by shifting their phenology earlier, all of which is going to ultimately increase their ecological impact on native plants and native communities. The next piece in terms of how climate change interacts with species is the idea of range shifts. And an important thing to bear in mind here is that climate change is happening incredibly fast. So hundreds of times faster, maybe thousands of times faster than any historic climate change that we can discern from the paleoclimate record. This is completely unprecedented certainly in the evolutionary history of North American plants. They've never experienced something like this before. And so I'm from Massachusetts. So just as an example, sort of graphically, when I was a kid, Massachusetts climate was relatively where Massachusetts geography is. That the current climate in the 20 teens kind of thing put Massachusetts closer to Northeast Pennsylvania and Northern New Jersey. And that by the end of this century, the projection is that even in the best case scenario in terms of a major reduction in emissions, which hopefully we're headed in that direction, we'll still be well down into the mid-Atlantic, if not into the southeast. And so, Pennsylvania, if you imagine this, could practically get into the ocean, I suppose, in terms of distance. So if a species wanted to move in order to keep up with climate change over a 100-year period, that species would need to move upwards of 800 miles. It's pretty far, right? So then the question is, well, how fast are native species moving? Is there any chance that some of them or many of them could keep up with this? So you might guess that the answer to that is no. So here's some evidence for that. There was a repeat survey done in the Green Mountains. This was in southern Vermont. So in 1964, there was a Forest Service survey that looked at essentially the edge of where northern hardwoods met boreal forest in the Green Mountains. And 40 years later, they went back and repeated those surveys and found this consistent with climate change, that northern hardwoods had expanded their elevation upward and that the boreal forest had contracted from those lower elevations. So back to that question of rate. So what they found was that, of course, these are trees, so they're not moving super fast as we might expect, but that on average, that tree line had moved about 600 feet upwards over 40 years. So 600 feet in 40 years versus 800 miles in 100 years, right? Not nearly close to fast enough. So the species that are, however, getting dispersed, there is a subset of plants that we're doing a great job of dispersing and essentially helping out, pre-adapting to future climate change. And those are species that are for sale as ornamental plants. So this was a study out of Europe where they were looking at, essentially where are we planting with nurseries our different plant species. And what they found was that most of the planting of, and then this is actually a native plant to Europe that was where its range was expanded. So the native range is in this red, and all of these green dots, which are a little hard to see on here, but going way up here are some green dots. Those are all nurseries selling rock soapwort in Europe. And so what was interesting about this study was that they found that the expansion of the range of ornamental plants was very much into a cooler climate direction. That is, with our ornamental plant industry, we are strongly favoring a bunch of species by planting them early into cooler climates that could then become sort of their suitable habitat in the future. So this is a native species in Europe. Of course, the challenge with this is that the bulk of ornamental plant sales are not native species. So this is a study that was this is just for a small sample in the state of Kentucky, but it's probably reasonably representative to what the ornamental plant industry looks like, which is that maybe a third of species are native plants within the ornamental industry, and that the majority of plants, these are coming from, this was a study that was looking where they were all coming from and types of plants, so I didn't include where they came from, but lots of different other parts of the world, essentially. And of course, we also know that when we look at pools of our invasive plants in the US, this was a study specifically on invasive plants in the US, our invasive plants are regulated noxious weeds. The more than half of those were introduced deliberately, and the largest pathway of that deliberate introduction is through the ornamental plant pathway. So essentially what this means is that instead of giving our native species that we know need to be responding to climate change and need to be expanding, instead of helping those plants to expand, we are giving the bulk of this head start to our non-native and even our invasive species. So a lot of times when we think about climate change, we're thinking about dispersal of like, well, how far can that seed blow along in the wind? Or how far is this beautiful bird going to take that seed? But the reality is that if we're planting bamboo, in our yards all across the East Coast, or if we're driving this horrible boat, from one pond to the next, that is how we're dispersing species across, plants across the landscape. One plus, though, I suppose, even though we see this large increases in risk, so this was from a study from a few years ago where we looked at 900 plants that are known to be invasive within the continental US, so essentially the geography that you see. And we modeled with climate change, so up to mid-century by 2050, where are those existing populations likely to shift to? And what we see is that the Northeast is a big recipient of lots of new range shifting invasive plants, and that the Southeast is essentially a donor of those same pools. So losing some of their existing population, but of course we're constantly importing new plants. So there's still there's still plenty to work on in the Southeast. But you can see Pennsylvania, just like the New England and New York, show up as predominantly red here, suggesting that there are, scores to 100, something like that, potentially new invasive plants that can move into this region. But the plus is that we know the identity of those species. They're down here right now. So Jenica Allen, who is the Living Land Lab Manager at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, who led the study on the previous slide, she worked with EdMaps, the folks at University of Georgia, to get all of that information, because there's models for 900 different species on here. And so what we can do is not only show a spatial map, but we can look at an individual species basis and say, well, what are those species? What do they look like, these species that are likely to show up in Pennsylvania by mid-century? So if you're interested in a watch list of species that are likely to show up in Pennsylvania by mid-century, I'd invite you to go to the EdMaps range shift listing tool. On the Risk Network website, also, we have a summary of how to use this tool, a tool summary, a little video, if you're interested in more of that. In the Northeast, well, I should say in New England, plus New York, we have been working across these 7 states to take these watch lists of species that are likely to expand into the New England region. And we've been doing a second prioritization on them based on those that have the highest impacts. So this is ongoing work, but we have at this point evaluated close to 200 species and come up with a shorter list of about 25 species that have high impacts on ecosystems, often have socioeconomic impacts as well, and are likely to affect ecosystems in the Northeast. And so I'm more than happy to share those lists for Pennsylvania as well, if any of you are interested in kind of, a priority list of what might be coming next. So take home point here is that invasive species ranges are shifting, but the silver lining is that we actually, for many of these species, know their identities, know what they are, and so that means that we have a chance to potentially get ahead of some of them. Topic number 3 is this idea that climate change is increasing disturbance to native ecosystems. So I'm sure, I think everybody on the East Coast is familiar with disturbance and has, have seen power line corridors or mowed edges of roads and the amount of invasive species that often colonize those types of areas. Climate change is also a form of disturbance. So it can be a disturbance in the form of, impacting native species. So for example, across a bunch of studies in the Western US, drought has been causing forest die-off, which creates a major disturbance, which causes an opening for invasive species. In the Eastern US, there aren't as many studies on or at least as of 2010, there weren't. But tree mortality has been tied to both severe winter and temperatures, hot summer temperatures. Again, if you lose trees, you have a disturbance. Certainly, the East Coast is also subject to other major forms of disturbance. So this is a graph of hurricane intensity in the Atlantic hurricanes from the 80s up until the early 2000s. And this graph continues over time. That the current science is that we're still not sure, not convinced that climate change is increasing the frequency, so the number of hurricane events, but we are very confident, I say we, largely climate scientists, are very confident that climate change is linked directly to the increased intensity, so higher magnitude, stronger hurricanes. Obviously, also a major form of disturbance. And we know from observing those power line corridors, observing roadside edges, that invasive species tend to thrive when you create these openings of increased disturbance. This graph on the left is one for garlic mustard. So essentially, if you increase light availability, so you create a disturbance, then you see an increase in the density of stems. If you also provide lots of seeds, but don't do anything to disturbance, you see a small increase. But if you have lots of seeds and a big disturbance, then you have these big flushes of garlic mustard, which I was just noticing at the edge of my property yesterday. Kudzu growing along road edges, also a good illustrative example of this disturbance response. So take home point from this is that climate extremes create a novel disturbance, and that we know that harm to native species and native ecosystems often creates an opening, a gap for invasive species to colonize, and eventually leading to spread and impact. All right, last point that I have is this plant response to rising CO2. You've probably seen a graph like this before, but this is from the, essentially the snapshot of what the atmosphere is doing over time. The one to really pay attention to is the black line, which is the average over this whole time period, right? So starting in the late 50s when this record began and going through essentially present day, we have moved from, in pre-industrial, we started at 280 parts per million, which is, you guys have probably heard these numbers in parts per million, and now we're well over 400. And there's no record of us being, essentially anywhere close to these numbers in the last, certainly million or so years in paleo history, through all of the past glacials and interglacials and stuff like that. Just as a point, because I think it's really interesting, you see the sawtooth pattern in here, right? So what causes the sawtooth pattern? That's essentially the difference between lots of terrestrial, like land in the northern hemisphere versus mostly ocean surface in the southern hemisphere. And so you end up with a sawtooth because we are, just on the downward trend of one of these sawtooths right now in the spring in the northern hemisphere, when all of these terrestrial plants are starting to green up, starting to grow, and essentially inhaling a whole bunch of that carbon dioxide. And then when we reach the sort of fall and winter, that's where we head back up on the other trend. But the important part is increasing over time. So back to high school biology. Remember, CO2 is really important for plant photosynthesis. If you add more CO2, the plants have better physiology on the whole. So plants generally tend to do better with higher CO2. We see increases in growth in trees and crops and shrubs and herbs. We also see increases in flowering, increases in fruiting, increases in seed mass. And in fact, this figure across the bottom is taken off of an ExxonMobil supported website from about 15 years ago, where they were arguing that you want more CO2 in the atmosphere because look at how big your pine tree grows if you have more atmospheric CO2. The challenge with all of these, though, is that it's relative, right? So if everybody has an advantage, some things have a bigger advantage. And it turns out that invasive plants are one of those groups that has a bigger advantage associated with these increase in resources. So this is from that same meta-analysis that we looked at way at the beginning, associated with elevated temperature, but now I'm adding the graph that they have for elevated CO2. So you can see that if you look at the blue, this is pretty small, the tiny little blue dot on here, those are native plants grown under elevated CO2. You can see that actually they are doing better than the zero line. So they are having a significant increase in performance associated with elevated CO2, but the invasive plants in the red square with this little star here saying they're significantly different are doing even better. And what is a mechanism for this? Probably it's because the weedier the species is, essentially the more invasive, the faster a species wants to grow, the bigger a species wants to get, the more resources it requires. And so as you add resources like elevated CO2, you build even more benefit to the species that require lots of those resources. The other piece of this is that not only do we see this effect of better performance of invasives with higher CO2, but we also see an effect on management, which is that as those invasive species under higher CO2 conditions get bigger, they also grow a lot more root mass, or at least some of them do, and that makes them harder to kill. And so this was an example of a study done with Canada thistle. So these are two plots that are essentially side by side. This one grown under ambient CO2, and this one grown under, I don't remember what the actual amount in parts per million was, but some estimation of what future CO2 might look like. Same amounts of Canada thistle planted in both of these plots. Both of these plots were treated with sort of the recommended amount of Roundup to kill them. And so you can see that under ambient CO2, so in the early 2000s, the recommended amount of Roundup killed almost all except for that guy, the Canada thistle plants. But if we fast forward to future CO2, and that recommended amount of Roundup killed very few of those Canada thistle plants. And that was because the Canada thistle ended up putting a lot more root biomass below ground, and so was able to recover relatively quickly after herbicide. So take home point that all plants do better with higher CO2, but those relative improvements really matter. And so we need to be watching out for hardier and tougher to manage invasive plants. So I wanted to just end with a couple of slides about, okay, so what do we do about these things? At the Risk Network website, we have another management challenge, which is called Taking Action, which is a synthesis of ideas that invasive species managers brainstormed at a North American Invasive Species Management Association meeting back in 2019. And we synthesized those ideas into a couple of pages to come up with some sort of starting points for our thinking moving forward. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. The other big thing that I think we really need to do in terms of preventing future invasive plants is to stop selling them, right? This is, I think I'm preaching to the choir in this case, but worth still emphasizing and emphasizing to everyone as you're talking about the importance of supporting native plant industry. The regulatory policies across the 50 US states are varied and very inconsistent. And so that leads to a lot of holes in where people can sell different species of plants. And it includes that our finding that 61% of over 1,000 known invasive plants remain for sale someplace within the US. This is even more of a problem when we're talking about climate change, because many of these species are for sale in places where they're not currently invasive. But if we looked a little bit further south, we would see that that is a problematic species. And so maybe we should stop propagating it in areas where it could become invasive in the future. Which leads to this sort of last point of the need for more proactive regulations to prevent future invasive plant sales. So we had taken a look at the state regulations, and only about 11% of plants that are prohibited for sale are listed proactively. That is where prohibiting the sale of a plant that's not yet present in a state. And of course, back to that original slide, there's a real opportunity for a rare win in invasive species management here, but it's going to require partnerships across borders. It's going to require thinking about what's coming next and trying to prevent, a real renewed focus on the prevention side of invasive species management. So I really appreciate you guys listening to me today. I know that there are some questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask Lisa to read some of those to me. But if you're interested in these topics or more of these topics, we absolutely love having more input at risknetwork.org. We have a listserv that we send out, communications every couple of weeks to the Risk Network. And you're also welcome to contact me directly. My email is on this slide. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Bethany. That was an incredibly informative presentation. A couple of questions in chat. The first comes from Bob White. Do most of these studies that you've referenced here deal with terrestrial upland plant species, or are there studies showing a similar pattern for aquatic species?
For aquatic plant species, yes, they are mostly terrestrial plant. I am not as familiar with the aquatic plant side of things. Many of the aquatic studies that I'm familiar with are more in the sort of macroinvertebrate fish kind of side of things. The plant ones, sorry for the vague response. The plant ones that I'm familiar with look more at or show more that it's not so much that the invasive species are responding better to temperature or CO2, but that the native species are responding much worse. So that they are, in our terrestrial systems, a lot of times what we're seeing is that there's this huge advantage for the invasives, but in the aquatic systems, the invasives are doing about the same, and it's the natives that are doing quite a bit worse. So the challenge there is a little bit different, and it's really supporting the native communities and reducing the disturbance for them.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Rachel asks, what would be an educated response to someone that might pose that perhaps invasives are the only plants that will survive in the future of human disturbance? Increased CO2, increased temps, deforestation, air and water contaminants, etc. That we are observing evolutionary response to human destruction of the natural environment. How would you respond to that?
So invasive species are invasive in a large part because they're responding to things that humans are doing, certainly. But humans are also capable of doing things that aren't destructive. I think hopefully many of this audience are in favor of, trying to support our native communities and our native plants. And there are also, many millions of species on Earth. So the ones that are invasive are still a relatively small subset of those. So I think that invasive species are just like all of the other environmental problems that are mentioned there. That things are not awesome, but that we actually have a lot of solutions to a lot of these different problems. And if we as a culture and as communities work in the direction towards remediating those environmental problems, invasive species are just a part of the challenges that we have ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, it also makes me think that argument needs to be, what needs to be understood in addition to that argument is the loss of every species that depends on native plants. So there's the whole trophic level impacts that I think we're starting to get better at communicating and better at understanding. Well, certainly better at understanding, but also better at communicating. And thanks to Doug Tallamy and his lab and folks like that. Yeah, this is I have something that I was pondering a little bit as you were presenting the responses of native plants and versus invasive plants to temperature, increased precipitation, and CO2. So, we're thinking of the context for this is really North America, right? And so it's curious to me to think about these species that are invasive here, like garlic mustard, and maybe that's not a great example. And I have lost track of, just how these, what the context for them is in their native range. So for example, garlic mustard, that might be an example species of where we're seeing it increase and, leaf out earlier, flower earlier. But how are these environmental factors affecting these species in their native ranges? Is this just simply, is one of the things we need to talk about here, the fact that these plants just have a competitive edge because they're devoid of all their, anyhow, I'll stop there. You want to respond to that?
Yeah, so no, that's a really interesting. So a scientist who's from Pennsylvania, who's at University of Pittsburgh, Sarah Kibbing, has done some really cool work on the native range versus the invaded range of a lot of the Northeast invasive species. And especially one thing that has stood out to me in her work is that the native range, if you look at sort of the history of climate variability, so the Northeast is actually a pretty climate variable place in terms of, our springs get like warm and then cold and then warm and then cold and stuff like that. And so that's an evolutionary push to push plants towards responding to daylight cues rather than temperature cues, right? Because if they green up too early, they're going to get hammered by the next snowfall. But a lot of the species that are invasive here are actually coming from, Eastern Asia, where there's less of that springtime variability. And so the plants there may be more likely to respond to temperature cues as opposed to daylight cues. That's a really small way to answer a really interesting question, but just I think it's fascinating thinking about what's going on in the native ranges and how the evolutionary history and the niche space and what types of competitors and predators you have, how that affects likelihood of invasiveness. But there's certainly a pretty decent subset of invasive plants that are weedy in their native range and also in their invasive range. And those are ones where it's like, okay, we could probably agree to just like not import those,
Right. Great. Thank you for that. Rachel poses a clarification to her question and asks, and I think the clarification is it likely that invasives are the most likely plants that will be able to survive in the future environmental conditions?
I think that invasive plants have many of the traits that allow for the flexibility associated with climate change, but that there are plenty of native plants that have those similar sort of flexibility. And in fact, for many of our native plants, we don't know if if they could persist in wider climate range because they're only, they were like hemmed in by a mountain range and they never got the chance to disperse kind of thing. So so the challenge there is, if you look at this sort of general pool of what we know, yes, invasive plants are responding more strongly to climate change, but we also haven't given a chance to like most of our native species. So we're kind of comparing it to this small subset that is actually a huge pool that we haven't really investigated in terms of, well, which of those species could persist, could be resilient, should we be trying to, plant in our gardens further north from their ranges.
Great. Thank you. Maeve asks, what's the best way to advocate for the ban on sale of invasive species that are present in Pennsylvania and that might come in as a result of climate change? Letters to our representatives, conversations with nursery managers. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm actually not sure where Pennsylvania is at. Actually, Lisa and I were talking about this a little bit before the seminar started. We have been in New England working with state invasive species councils or invasive plant councils. And we've gotten a lot of really great reception from folks on each of those councils when we've said, okay, here's a list and here's a priority species on that list that we've evaluated and here are our evaluations. And then the states, when they're doing their risk assessments and reevaluations, have been able to take those as sort of a starting point of like, it's not feasible to evaluate 1,000 species, but maybe these 20, are feasible. So I would say that, and I am excited one of these days to expand our work from New England and New York down into the Mid-Atlantic, which includes Pennsylvania. So if anyone in the audience is part of invasive plant councils in Pennsylvania or has links to those, then I'd be really eager and happy to talk to you about subsets of species. The nursery industry is interesting, and I will say I don't know a whole lot about what the different motivations are for nursery industries. We've started some conversations with some nurseries in Western Massachusetts, very small sample, and we've already found the sort of huge diversity in sort of motivations, knowledge, and interests of the different nursery growers, including whether they're even growing their own plants versus importing them from, general wholesalers and stuff like that. So I don't know that there is sort of a single way to to engage the nursery industry. But certainly continuing to get the message out to buyers, to homeowners and or anyone who's planting plants is, I think, an ongoing good approach.
Great. Okay, last call for any questions for Bethany. These were great. Okay, I'm going to encourage everybody to stay in touch with the pabotany.org website. That's where the recording of this webinar will land, and you'll be notified of that as soon as we get it edited and on the website. More information there about webinars and upcoming programming as well. And if you're not on our mailing list and you heard about this webinar and from a friend or a colleague, let us know, reach out to PA Botany, and we will happily get you onto our mailing list. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much. This was an exceptional webinar and just truly great information. Thank you for all you're doing to help educate the public about the issue and to really provide the important science that's needed for all of us to understand how these species will continue to wreak havoc on our natural landscapes going forward. So we appreciate your time. This was a wonderful contribution to our work.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, and hopefully everyone keep up the good fight.
Thanks. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.